welcome to everyone. And Happy New Year. I know we're already quite a ways into February, but this is our first webinar for the new year, so I feel like that's appropriate to say. Hi everyone, my name is Leah, and I'm the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator at Women's Shelters Canada. I am going to be moderating today's webinar, and I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have. It's going to be really interesting. So I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I know that there are people joining us today from across Turtle Island. That's the beauty of the webinar format. And so please do feel free to say hi, let us know where you're joining from in the chat. And if you're not sure what territory you're on, this is an opportunity or a reminder to look that up and learn a little bit more about it. So before we get into the presentation and our conversation for today, just a few little housekeeping things here. So just one last reminder that if you want to listen in English, most of today's presentation or all of it will be in English, and so you don't need to adjust anything. If you want to listen in French, pour celles qui veulent écouter en français, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton Interprétation en dessous de votre écran et sélectionner l'option French ou Français pour avoir l'audio en français. And if you're having any problems with the interpretation at any point, just let me know in the chat and I'll do what I can to help you out with that. Now, you've probably noticed you don't have access to audio or video for yourself. Only our panelists do today. And that's just because we have quite a few people with us, over 100 people, and we want to make sure everyone can hear the presenters really clearly. And so we're just, keeping things a little bit limited in terms of video and audio. But we do still want your participation for sure. And so there are two ways you can do that. I see some of you are already using the chat feature, which is wonderful. So just a reminder that you can change your chat to all panelists and attendees in the to line when you click on the chat, if you want everyone to see your message. If you just want to send a message to me and the panelists, maybe you're having a tech issue, you can leave it at all panelists. The other way you can participate is through the Q&A box. And so that's also on the bottom of your screen, right beside the chat. And that is the best way to submit a question if you have a question for the panelists. And so it just allows us to really keep track of those questions, to keep them in one spot. And what we're going to do is keep track of those questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll get through as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar today. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box. If you want to say hi, if you have a comment, anything like that, put it in the chat. So without further ado, we'll get into it. We're here today, as you know, to talk about putting harm reduction into practice at VAW shelters and transition houses. And it's a really special opportunity that we have here today to kind of go beyond talking about, the big ideas of harm reduction and low barrier access, and really look at sort of the details, the process of how to put that into practice. How do you do that? And we're going to get some insight into that from our two presenters. So we have Ketsia Houde-McLennan from the Yukon Women's Transition Home and Elizabeth Plishka of Blood Ties for Direction, also in the Yukon. And they're currently going through a process together to sort of move towards a harm reduction approach at the Yukon Women's Transition Home. And so they're going to tell us about that process and share some of their insights, some of their experiences so far. And I think that's going to be a really great conversation for all of us. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now, the last thing before I pass it over to them, we do want to start by just getting a sense of who's with us today and where you're at kind of with harm reduction, with low barrier access in your shelter or your organization. And so I've just launched a poll there. It should pop right up on your screen. If not, you might be able to click on it on the bottom. I encourage you to take a second and answer. So we're just asking, your shelter or transition house, are you high barrier right now? Are you already low barrier? Are you somewhere in the middle? Let us know. And it just gives us a sense of who's here and helps kind of target the conversation a little more. So many of you are voting. I'm going to give it another 10 or 20 seconds. Okay, most of you have voted. 5 more seconds. All right, so I'm going to end the poll and take a look at our results. So it looks like 60% of you are sort of that moderate barrier, kind of in the middle zone, 32% low barrier, and 8% high barrier. So it's great to have that range here, right? It gives us a lot to talk about and to work with. And so I think that's going to lead to a really interesting conversation today. So thanks everyone for participating. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Elizabeth and Ketsia.
All right, so welcome everyone. Leah has given us a wonderful introduction, so I don't feel like I need to give much of an introduction to either the presentation. I will just say my name's Elizabeth, use she, her pronouns, and as was said, I work at Blood Ties 4 Directions, which is the harm reduction agency in Whitehorse. And I'm the health education coordinator here.
And I'm Ketsia Houde. I'm the executive director at the Yukon Women's Transition Home. There's one transition home in Whitehorse, and we're it at this time. It's 9 to 15 beds transition home, and we also 15 second stage apartments.
So Leah did a wonderful land acknowledgement, and I'll just acknowledge that both Ketsia and I are on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dun and Tonquichan First Nations Council up here in Yukon. And yeah, just as far as questions go, type them in the Q&A. Ketsia and I are going to try to leave lots of time for questions at the end to be able to answer all of those. And we also will give our emails at the end for any future contact purposes.
Thanks. I'm going to turn off my video because my internet is spotty at home. So I guess the first thing we wanted to talk about is, like, for us at the Women's Transition Home, is why we decided to start this journey of trying to see if can we lower our barrier for women using our services. So the reason why we're doing it is that we are very aware that there is a gap in our community for women fleeing violence and using substances. So it's been a conversation that's been happening at the transition home for forever, like for at least 10 years, of should we go low barrier? Should we change how our policy around access and substance use? So it's been something that's been happening. And then we've just had an evaluation by our funder. And they're recommending that we look at, can we lower barrier further? Can we increase our harm reduction practices? So it's really a pressure from our funder, which is, I guess, is the little push that that we needed maybe to move forward. It's also in the current social movement toward harm reduction approach, including in the Women's Transition Home world, where Women's Shelter Canada has produced reports. The BC Transition Homes Society has produced a toolkit. So there's a general movement toward that, and the knowledge that it's a big gap for us. There's also the ethical challenge to refuse service to women in need. I'm currently the director of the shelter, but I was the manager for a while. And the one thing, the recurrent thing in supervision that came up for workers is the ethical challenge of having to refuse women. You have a woman that shows up to your doorstep. It took her all the strength and courage she has to ask for help and come here and leave the partner she has, whether for the night or for longer. And you're turning her away because she was drinking when the assault happened, or she's struggling with substance use, and that's an ethical challenge to not open the doors to that person. I think we also have, I think all the workers in this field know that substance use is also used by perpetrators to retain control. And whether it's alcohol or drugs, it's often something that perpetrators will push over women to keep them intoxicated, to keep a better control over them. It's also used by women and men identified people to manage and cope with the violence they're experiencing. So all that in mind is why we decided to start this journey with Blood Ties.
Sorry about that. My computer did not want to unmute myself, or didn't want to unmute. So just talking about moving to low barrier, I know that there have been presentations on the past on harm reduction. I'm not going to spend a huge time defining harm reduction, but I do want to talk a little bit about just the philosophy that I take with harm reduction and the indigenized approach that I talk about when I am talking about harm reduction with other social service providers, because that'll also provide some context for maybe how to look at your own policies with that lens, as well as just some context for how we went through this journey. So I really like this indigenized model of harm reduction that was made it was actually a youth sexual health group. And it just talks about how the traditional model of harm reduction is the pillar model, and only one of the pillars is of the 4-pillar model of harm reduction is actually is harm reduction, and there are also other pillars. So it's not a very holistic approach to harm reduction, and it doesn't do the greatest job, in my opinion, of explaining what harm reduction is. And I find that, you know, when I'm talking to people on the surface level, defining harm reduction as meeting people where they're at is all great and wonderful to understand. But then when it comes to actually changing your policies, applying harm reduction, especially with those people that are maybe a bit higher needs, and how to reduce barriers to ensure we are meeting everyone where they're at, it can be tricky to be able to do so. So I really like using the 4-fire model of harm reduction when I'm thinking about harm reduction. And some of the things that I really like about it, I'm not going to go over all the fires, but this is recorded and I'm happy to send out the presentation if anyone wants it. But the thing that I really like about the 4-fire model of harm reduction is that it's looking at these different aspects as a fire, which needs to be tended. It needs to, you can't just start a fire and leave it. And that's the same thing when you're practicing harm reduction, when you're practicing low barrier. It's not something that you can check off. It's something that you kind of have to be continually checking in if you are keeping your services low barrier, if you're keeping your staff trained so that, you know, they can provide that low barrier care. And even though this is an indigenized model of harm reduction, it definitely doesn't just work when it comes to, you know, your Indigenous clients or people who are accessing services or anything like that. This is a model that if you are asking yourself if you're being culturally safe, if you're allowing people to go through reclamation, self-determination, and having their own sovereignty, it's, you know, that's applicable to anyone and everyone who's accessing your services.
Yeah, and for the shelter, the discussion we've been having with the staff and the clients in the partner agencies is what is it going to look like for us? And one thing that, like in Whitehorse, especially, we have one homeless emergency shelter, and they went from one agency that was running it, who was pretty high barrier, well, I guess low barrier for a homeless shelter, but to a change in agency running it, to the government running it, to become more of like a, I guess might not be the right word, but well shelter. People are allowed to be under influence, that if they have alcohol with them, it'll be put away in a cupboard, and then once they're ready to leave, they'll be given back their alcohol or the substances to go outside to use. And it's been kind of a shock for the community, and there's been challenges with behavior at the shelter, around the shelter. So people are kind of afraid of what low barrier might mean based on some experience and what's going on there. So at our transition home, when we're starting to talk about let's lower barrier, let's increase our harm reduction practice, staff were really afraid that it would become a place where women could be under the influence at all time. And what we're trying to clarify is that we will remain a sober environment. We do serve women and children who often come from a place where the parent using violence was under the influence. So an adult under the influence can be very scary for these children. We also work with women who are trying to maintain their sobriety. So it's important for us to remain a sober environment. The barrier we are lowering is to access the services. So that means that if someone is under the influence, it's not an automatic no. We'll see where she's at or where they are at, because we're a woman, we serve women identified people. And does she have a few drinks? Can she just sleep it off? Is she very intoxicated? Does she need to go to the hospital or detox first? Maybe a hotel is better for the night. Maybe she's not able to remain sober. So looking at what that looks like for us. And in her case, what we're going toward is it remains a sober environment, but the access, the barriers are lowered for the accessing the services.
So with that in mind, when you are trying to lower barriers and you're trying to move towards harm reduction policies, it can be a really tricky thing to do, because you kind of have to look at your policies through the lens of looking for what barriers there might be. And the barriers might be super obvious with this example in mind. Yep, funders were pushing, it was for the change. It was obvious that there was a barrier because people were being turned away. Sometimes the barrier does look like people not choosing to access the service because there's a barrier that you might not know about. And those barriers can obviously be really tricky to identify because you don't know, obviously you don't know about them. You can't interact with people who aren't accessing your service. That being said, in moving towards harm reduction policies, going through your policies with a really fine-tooth comb and with the lens of looking for what barriers might exist. So for example, a previous organization that I worked with, they had the policy that if it was minus 40 or below, then the organization didn't open up. And their thinking with that one was that by not opening up when it's minus 40, then they're not encouraging people to go outside and access the service when it's really cold out and when it could be dangerous because it's cold out. But if you look at that from a harm reduction barrier reducing lens, then, and you think of the scenario, well, what if someone doesn't have access to the knowledge that the organization is closed or that it's minus 40, and they try to access the service and then they get to the organization and it's closed? That's way more dangerous than having a really slow day in the office because not a lot of people are coming outside because it's really, really cold. But the point being that if you are interested in lowering your barriers, moving towards harm reduction philosophy-based policies, then you really have to look at all of your policies with that lens and try to think of any barriers. You also want to think about what barriers you're trying to lower. With the example, or with moving to the shelter being the way that it is, the women's shelter, they're trying to lower that barrier of access. So if that's the barrier you're trying to lower, then you want to keep that in mind while you're looking at your policies. What other access barriers might there be that we haven't thought of yet?
Yeah. And at the Women Transition Home, so I've put an excerpt from a new access service policy. So I think our previous policy, no, I don't remember what it was called. I think it was admission policy. So we've changed the name to access service policy. And the previous one was talking about that if you're under influence, that likely you won't be able to access. So the new policy we've decided to write is that if there's a woman or children, because there might be teenagers, 16-year-old daughters or sons or older, that are under the influence when they access with their parent, will be met with a harm reduction approach. And that can be pretty vague. Like the staff are like, what does that mean? So that's where Blood Ties, I think, is helping us in providing training around that. And what does that look like? What does that look like for us? And then the other element that's really important is that that sometimes people wanting to access services have behaviors that makes the rest of the shelter unsafe, whether it's because of substance use or because it's of mental health, someone who might be who might be having a psychosis, or someone who's just pretty volatile for whatever reasons going on in their life right now. We have that policy that if the behavior is not conducive or safe, then we'll be referring them elsewhere. And that might mean seeing if there's a bed at detox, seeing if there's a bed at the hospital, seeing with them, is there a family member somewhere they could go for the time being. Right now we have a pilot project that we have funds to put them up in a hotel. So that's kind of how we're looking at it. And one other question in the procedure for staff is she or her children exhibiting behaviors that could negatively affect herself or others? So instead of like having the somewhat judgmental approach of, is she under substances? Is she high? Does she smell? And does she smell alcohol? How her eyes, are they dilated? Does she look high? All those not very dignity preserving or respectful assessment. We're going toward like, how is she able to understand the intake? We're talking about consent to service. Is she able to follow us? How is she? So it's a fine balance to find what the assessment tool you use, because we're not doctors or nurses. But yeah, so switching away from kind of a judgment and zero tolerance toward a behavior-based assessment and who can access their services.
And I'll just add in addition to that, that I think sometimes there can be a bit of a hesitation or questions around what low barrier means, especially because sometimes people who are under the influence of various substances can exhibit behaviors that are unsafe, and it absolutely is okay and necessary to have those safety measures in place as far as keeping your staff safe, absolutely, but keeping it be behavior based as opposed to just under the influence or not based is obviously a way more harm reduction approach that reduces barriers for a lot of people, because a lot of people, even if they are under the influence of substances, they're still able to to be polite, to access the shelter, and to not be a disruption.
So yeah, and I just gonna sorry, Elizabeth, I'm just going to mention too that this is one policy that we worked on, and we also have to work on our substance use policy. Like there's another bunch of policy we'll have to look at as well that we haven't done yet, but it's in the process of doing.
Mm-hmm. And so I know that Ketsia is going to be talking for half of this slide, but as far as harm reduction, or I guess a part of the transition to being a more harm reduction based organization was definitely this training, and we're still going through trainings, but having confident and well-trained staff is a really, really important part of being able to have an organization that not only has harm reduction based policies, but also practices harm reduction. Because you can have a policy that says that, you know, it's whether or not someone gets to access the service is behavior based. But then if you have staff that are uncomfortable around people who are under the influence, or you have staff that are going to jump to, you know, think that the behavior is less okay, or the behavior being exhibited is less okay because the person is under the influence, then your harm reduction policy isn't doing much, because your staff isn't actually following through with what the harm reduction policy is. And it's definitely, it can be hard to have well-trained staff, to have staff that are confident. These are, you know, demanding jobs already that require a lot of emotional care. You're asking a lot of emotional care from all of your staff with this kind of work, and asking them to also extend that to people who may potentially be not the most well behaved can be really hard. But the more confident people are, the more well trained they are, the you know, and things like having training around de-escalation is a really, really important one, to have staff that will remain confident and calm and are able to follow through with all of those harm reduction policies.
Yeah, and at the transition home, so we're like where we started, we had all our staff, we have about 16, I guess a total of 25 staff with admin and support and all the other jobs, but maybe like 16 transition home workers. And maybe half to a third were saying this was meant to be a sober place. We do not want to go there. Yes, it's hard to say no to women, but we don't think that's safe to do. And we're not nurses. We are not medical provider. We are not equipped to do assessments. And then the other half to two-thirds of the staff were saying there's harm reduction. Is this possible to do this? We feel that we should go there and that we're ready to do this. So it's working with a team that half is not really wanting to do it, and the other half is like, yes, let's do it. So you have to see where your team is at. We actually did surveys and to ask staff anonymously where they were at, to see where we're starting from. And then as we're walking toward this, as the funder is pushing us to go to do this, so we decided to change our policy. We decided to ask Blood Ties to help us and provide training. And then we're facing resistance, and that's normal. Like when you change things, humans don't like change, and that's a normal behavior. So people are afraid, as I mentioned, that it was going to become a place where it's just free for all, that it's not a sober place anymore. And staff are afraid for their own safety. Like it does happen that people who are intoxicated, their behavior might be unsafe. So often we always try to have at least 2 workers on site, but sometimes they're single staffed and there's nobody around. So there's safety issues to consider. The staff are also concerned for the women who are trying to maintain sobriety, and often when they're not sober, then people hurt them, and it's just a cycle of hurt and being hurt. As I mentioned before, the children who left homes where parents are using violence, and there's also the fact that some moms and children are mandated by family and services to come to our shelter. and the mom is being told, if you don't leave your partner, we're removing the children. So if her space isn't safe anymore for the children, she'll have nowhere to go and she'll lose her kids. So there's pretty high stakes at hand here to take in consideration in how we're going to lower the barrier, how we're going to increase our harm reduction. So as we're doing training, we also added some group supervision. We have a practice support person that we work with, that she's been facilitating discussions with the staff and going through these questions, going through these fears, like what's the fear, what's the concern, and then having space for management to say, actually, no, it's going to remain a sober environment. We've been doing a good demonstration in the past, because let's not kid ourselves, women have been using inner space since we've been open. Like, we find vodka bottles in rooms when people don't come back. Like, it's people are using inner space. It's happening already. So how can we make it safer for everybody who's using inner spaces? And just the last thing I wanted to mention is that, as I mentioned, half of our staff was not super for it. And it happened that it was more the more senior staff who's been there for longer. So they kind of have maybe a heavier weight in the dynamic in the team. But it's like, yes, we want to support staff. We want to be with them. But sometimes you just got to push things to change. And in our case, the funder was that big push. Like, yeah, if you want funding, you need to look at this. So it's like, okay, I guess we'll do it. But yeah, so it's a dynamic, and you have to work with it. But you have to be really careful, because I've heard of situations where I was actually talking with my colleague from Watson Lake, from the Help and Hope Women's Trenching Home in Watson Lake in Yukon, telling me that they went lower barrier kind of very quick, and without, like, they went there really quickly. And she, with insight, she's saying there was an error because they burnt a lot of staff. People left. They had a really high turnover. So there's also a risk of going too fast. So yeah.
And I do just want to highlight what Ketsia said about that, trying to find out what the fear is. What, from your staff, what is the fear? What is the frustration? Why are they resisting the change? Because a lot of times it is, a fear of safety, something like that. And absolutely allowing staff, giving them time to to adjust to the change and not going super fast is really important. At one point, you absolutely do just have to push for the change. And the reality is, some staff might not be fit to provide really low barrier harm reduction services, and they might leave, or there might have to be a conversation with them about the resistance to the change, because it is very hard work to do, and you're absolutely demanding a lot of your staff by asking them to be really, really low barrier. But at the end of the day, you have to keep in mind, are you here for your staff, or are you here for the people who are accessing your services? And absolutely encourage self-care for staff, and encourage them, make sure that that those that that they're keeping themselves safe, and that staff safety is really important, and you want to make sure that you're not entirely there just for the people who are accessing your services. You are there for your staff, but at the end of the day, if a staff isn't providing those low barrier services, then you need to take a good look at why. And some staff may just choose that that's not the type of work that they want to be doing, and that's okay.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like the balance between client-centered and staff-centered. And sometimes the balance, like, you go toward more staff-centered, especially in times like COVID, where people are afraid. And so it's like, how do you push back toward more staff client-centered services? And that's always a dance, I guess I could say. The other element to, like, for lowering barriers is funding. Like, as I mentioned, in our case, our physical space we don't have that physical space to, like, have a kind of interim access where maybe there's rooms that are not in the same common areas as the other one, so that someone who's very intoxicated could sleep it off, and then the next day she could just join the rest of the women. So in our case, we're using hotels for women who are very intoxicated, or that we know from experience working with them for years that when they're intoxicated, their behavior is unsafe for the space. So also using that knowledge of people you work with on a regular basis. We do have regular clients, as living a relationship with violence, or many partners with violence, is a journey. So it's not, as we all know, it's not a one thing, one out and you're good. So looking at your physical space, is it possible to have a safe access? If not, what then? So in our case, it's hotel rooms. We're also looking at, we have one of our second stage suite is on the first floor. We could transform it into a low barrier suite, but that will require money, negotiation with our funders, discussions about we're losing an apartment, which is very needed. We're always full in our second stage program. So like looking at all these things and weighing all the options. Right now we have this pilot project that allows us to pay for alternate accommodation. Right now it's hotel, maybe anything else. And the hotel in our case is sometimes it's for one night, sometimes it's ongoing because the person in her life isn't able to remain sober at this time, or because there's mental health, either for the woman or for her children. Like we had a situation where there's a parent with a child who had autism, and living in a communal space was not good for that child, and they were not going to do well. And the parents told us that. So we had that option to say, okay, we'll pay for a hotel, you'll be safe with your children, we'll provide food and support until you can find housing. So that was actually a great thing that we had, that low barrier isn't always about substances. It can also be about mental health and disabilities. For us, what's really making this pilot project successful, it's only been like, I think 4 months now, but the success is really based on the outreach worker. It takes a lot of time to settle the women, to bring them food, to support them. So like the person is only there 40 hours a week. So there's a good part of the week that there's the regular staff that deals with it, but it's a lot of work. So for us, it's looking at like, and for anybody who wants to do that, like what the spaces you have, what options do you have, maybe whether, agreements with other agencies where a person could spend a first night, things like that, and innovate the space you have. Yeah, and I guess I wanted to mention, so the resources in doing this work, that's like we're partnering with Blood Ties right now. We're also working based on the Society of Trenchant Home Society that had developed a toolkit and a report on reducing barriers. So we're working with that, and like using your own knowledge and expertise, because it's really different depending on where you are, depending on your staff, depending of the people using your services. Are there other options in town and where you live? So that's important. And knowing, like I was discussing with my colleagues from Dawson City and Watson Lake this morning, and looking, I think, at lowering barrier and harm reduction on a spectrum, and seeing like where can you go on that spectrum, from like being very high barrier to very like no barrier. Like where do you want to go, and where are you able to go with who you have as a staff, as a team, as a community. And also that it changes day to day, because if we have 12 kids in the house, we won't be able to accommodate someone that's intoxicated. If we have no kids, we might be able to accommodate someone who's more intoxicated than we would usually. So it's a dance, it's everyday assessment, and it's the staff doing those decision and assessment on an ongoing basis 24/7. So
yeah, and Ketsia and I have put up our emails. You're free to contact either one of us if you have any questions or anything like that. I do see that there are a few questions in the Q&A though already.
Yeah, there are. So thank you both so much for that. Elizabeth, maybe you can take your screen share off and we'll do the Q&A. Perfect. Yeah, so thank you both. That was a really, really interesting presentation. And I think that's demonstrated, or there's a testament to that in how many questions we have. So what I'm going to do is, there's a few questions, similar questions. There's a few themes coming out. So I'm going to try to combine some of these questions so we can get to as many things as possible. So one of the questions or issues that has been raised a few times, I'll just sort of read an example here. One person who has shared, at our shelter, it has been challenging to maintain a calm, safe environment for women and particularly children fleeing abusers who use substances and suffer from trauma, which causes them to shout and yell and exhibit other difficult and frightening behaviors. And sometimes we struggle with accepting some behavior from residents that we would not accept from abusers. And so there have been, quite a few people raising those questions just about the children, the fact that there are children in the environment. So maybe each of you can speak to that.
Yeah, I could start. We actually had the same discussion this morning with the two directors from the Watson Lake and Dawson, and how do you manage those difficult behavior? And it's always that difficult balance of, there's that individual safety that's seeking safety right now, is seeking your support, and then there's the whole house, including children, staff, and other women. So sometimes it's really heart-wrenching, but you have to ask someone to leave if they like. Our purpose at the detention home is that we'll meet with that woman, the staff will try, then the management will try. If that hasn't changed, we'll ask that person if they're able to work on the behavior. Are they able to change? What support do they need for that to happen? And if that keeps happening, at some point we have to ask them to leave. And it's really hard. Like I've asked women to leave, and I know they have to go back to somewhere that's not safe. But if they're unable to be in the space, it's like those, it's really hard. And sometimes you push things and you try and it's just, it doesn't happen. And yeah, those are very difficult times.
Yeah, I mean, my advice would be just de-escalation training. Make sure that not only do your staff have de-escalation training, but are confident using those skills. And absolutely, sometimes there are some people that if their behavior is unacceptable and putting either staff or other people who are accessing the service at risk, then it's not safe for them to be there. That also doesn't mean that you have to completely ban them, right? There are steps before that, having an outreach worker talk to them, having someone higher up talking to them. I often find explaining why the behavior isn't acceptable is really, really helpful, because sometimes people don't know. So, you know, pointing out that there are children in the shelter, this is unsafe for this reason. And if it comes to having to, you know, the person can't access services that day, then maybe that's what just has to happen to keep the children safe, and they can try again tomorrow. Absolutely, it's a challenge. It's going to be a challenge to keep everyone safe. De-escalation is, you know, I think is my number one piece of advice, and just that even when you're trying to be low barrier, you can still kick people out. I would recommend no lifetime bans, but you know, if someone can't be in a space that day, then it's okay to tell them that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and at the shelter we have like levels of like, well, today you have to leave, this isn't working. And then we have clients that we have to put on no access list because we've tried and and it's not working. And it's never a lifelong ban. Like the process that once you're ready, you can meet with the manager and the ED, and then we'll discuss and see, are you able to be accountable for your behavior? Is there a plan for you to not have these behavior when you access? And is that possible? And we try, and sometimes we have to go back to them not being able to access, but we try. Yeah, and it's difficult, and that's the challenge. It's like we are unable to fulfill everybody's need, and that's difficult because you would want to help everyone, and sometimes you can't, and that's heart-wrenching.
Sure. And one of sort of related, one of the comments that has come up a few times in the chat and the Q&A box here is people saying, you know, the ideal might be that there is a separate wing or a separate space in the shelter that can sort of have a different set of rules almost. So for people who are using substances, or maybe the behaviors wouldn't be appropriate elsewhere in the shelter. And I think Ketsia, you had sort of you spoke to this a little bit earlier, just in terms of, you know, you would really like to have a bed or a room for that, but it would remove a bed from you know, normal service. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add or speak to kind of around that point.
I guess there's like the new builds, like people who are building shelters. And I know in Whitehorse, there's a proposal that's been put out for because CMHA is funding some new shelters in Canada right now. And I know the First Nation, the Council of the Yukon First Nation put out a proposal, and they're putting in the proposal that there'll be a space for low barrier. So their goal is to be able to serve everyone so that they don't have to say no. I'm sure they'll have to say no at some point. It does happen, but that families and children are safe, and then there's a space for women who are using, they'll be safe as well. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think there are shelters that might be organized that way. We don't have the capacity for now, and it's difficult. And sometimes it's looking at hotels and other space.
And on the point of the hotel, because we have a few questions about that approach. So one of the questions is asking, you know, if you do need to put someone up in a hotel, how long are you able to do that for? Is it just the one night? And also asking about sort of if you have any liability if you're sending someone to a hotel and then let's say there's an overdose or something happens while they're staying at the hotel because it's not quite as supervised maybe as the shelter environment.
Yes, those are very good questions. We're just as I mentioned, like we started doing this in October, so it's been a few months. One of the main things for us has been that the low barrier outreach worker is developing relationship with the hotel management and explaining why we're doing this. We're not talking about low barrier. We're talking about we need more capacity for women. And I think that maybe is helping hotel managers to have a more open heart to helping us. But we're dealing with women who aren't able to stay in our space. So we're very aware there's a risk for them to be in these spaces. And we've had to pay for damages for broken sinks and things, smoking in the room, which is not allowed. So we've had to pay those damages. At the same time, the hotel owners were surprised that we wanted to pay them because they say that social assistance is usually refusing to pay any damages done from clients. So they were surprised and happy with us, saying like, yes, we want to pay this. We want you to be happy with us. So yes, there are liabilities. There's also risk, and that's part of like the assessment. There's clients that happens that they've come to a shelter, there was substance use, there was an overdose. So it's like, it's not safe to be in the shelter, but is it safe to send her to a hotel by herself? And sometimes the answer is no. So in those cases, we would not put them by themselves in the hotel. We would refer them to detox, to the hospital. Depending on the weather outside, we might even call the MS or the RCMP to pick them up if they're very intoxicated, because it's unsafe to be out there at this temperature. So yes, there are liabilities. Yes, there's people that they can go in the hotel by themselves. It's not safe. So yeah, Elizabeth, Elizabeth also, I guess at Blood Ties, you do help people in housing. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, I guess the only other thing that I just add is also providing some context around the Whitehorse housing situation, because it's awful, essentially. And there are a couple hotels that do, or it's fairly common, I guess, for especially people in low socioeconomic situations in Whitehorse to either rent a hotel just for a night or even for a month. And some of the hotels have that option because there's just literally no housing available. So I guess just providing that context. But yeah, absolutely. Blood Ties also, we have a housing coordinator. We help with housing. Sometimes we put people up in hotels as well, and there are those liabilities, and you want to do everything you can to make sure they're safe, making sure they know how to use naloxone. For example, with there was a question around that overdose, and providing them with all the education that you can. If you think they need any education, well, they're not going to be in a supervised space. But yeah, at the end of the day, if that's the safest option for them, then it is going to be riskier for them than being, at the shelter, but it still is a safer option.
Thank you both. So a slightly different
Maybe I'll
direction now.
just
Oh, yep.
sorry, I just wanted to answer the question about the number of days. Sometime it'll be one day just for the night. And right now we're seeing people that we're housing them for 2 weeks, and then it's pushing. And often we'll contact if they have a housing coordinator worker or income support worker, and say, is there a way you can take them over and pay for their room? Because we can't sustain this for a long time. It's very expensive. So it's from 1 day to 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, but I think we've housed someone for 1 month, and that was very expensive at a daily rate. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a few people who've asked about, just the impact of COVID on all of this, because obviously that's a huge factor right now. And so people sharing that, they have found that COVID has kind of raised barriers in some cases because, maybe women or folks at the shelter, they can't use on site, but you don't want them leaving and coming back because of the COVID risk. So just how COVID has impacted this, whether you've sort of factored that into the changes you're making in any way and that kind of thing.
Yeah, COVID in the Yukon is a bit different than the rest of the country, as we have 0 cases. We haven't had a new case in 6 weeks, so it's a different situation than the rest of the country. Although if I think about in March 2020 when it started, the staff were very concerned of residents leaving during the day and coming back. We went as far as putting a contract and telling women they had to stay out a maximum of 2 hours a day, but I think we went away from that because it was too unethical, and just kind of raised the safety procedures for the staff instead to keep them safe. And also having the idea that there will always be risk in coming to work. The director who I'm replacing right now, while she's on leave, said, like, if you look at grocery workers who are at the till serving hundreds and hundreds of people every day with little protection, like there always will be a risk to come to work, and it's like balancing these things. For COVID for us, yes, and we're not where the rest of the country is, and being staff-centered and staff safety versus supporting women who are victims of violence. So that would be kind of partial answer.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just, add that COVID has really thrown a loop in everything, and absolutely it's raised barriers. We've had to put a cap on how many people we can accept in our drop-in at one time so that everyone can remain socially distanced. And sometimes that means turning people away because our drop-in is full, and we have a time limit on our drop-in as well. So if someone new comes and wants to access services, that might mean saying to someone, okay, you've been here for 2 hours, you've used up your time, now you have to leave, which is adding a barrier. So yeah, it's absolutely a tricky balance between being client-centered and being staff-centered and keeping everyone safe, and it's going to look different depending on where you are and what the COVID situation is. So I can't really give any super direct answers, but reality is barriers are going to be higher because of COVID in order to keep everyone safe, and that's okay.
Okay, so I'm going to try to go through some questions now about staff, working with staff on this. And so 2 questions that came up on that front. One of them is about whether you have any suggestions for trainings for staff through a harm reduction lens. So I know you talked about some of the kind of topics or areas of training, but anything specific, I guess. And then also, Ketsia, you'd mentioned that you had done a survey with staff. And so just asking sort of the kinds of questions that you asked or would recommend exploring with staff in terms of just assessing their readiness and where they're at.
So as far as the suggested training, my number one suggestion would be de-escalation training, as I've talked about before. As far as harm reduction specific training, I don't really have any specific recommendations. My recommendation would be to try and reach out to your harm reduction agency and see if they do provide social service provider training. Harm reduction is unique in every single city, just due to the realities of that city. So they're going to be able to give your staff specific training based on based on your organization, what it looks like, where your barriers are at, and where you want them to be.
Yeah, for us too, like I think we're identifying that we need to do training on internal biases, whether it's about racism or oppression or like bias against people who use substances. For like lots of our workers have lived experience. So what was their experience with substance use and what is it currently, and how is it affecting their view of clients using substances or having mental health issues? So that's also something to look at. Like it's kind of an introspection moment as a team, as an organization, as an individuals, to kind of push yourself to be out of your comfort zone. And what was the other question? Sorry.
About the type of question you asked in the
Oh, the
survey
survey.
with staff.
I wouldn't be able to. I didn't do this survey myself because I wasn't in the organization at the time, so I don't know. But I'd be willing to share it if people want to email me about it.
Great, thank you. So we are getting quite close to the end here. I'm going to try to fit in maybe one more question, and that's just around Ketsia. I can't quite remember whether you operate some second stage units as well, but just some questions around that. Given that a lot of second stage units or shelters, there aren't always staff there 24/7, and so just if you can speak to that at all, whether that's a little bit different, how you manage that, or thoughts on that if you don't have second stage units.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't actually include that in my presentation, but we do have second stage. We have second stage apartments within the emergency shelter in the same building. So that is staffed 24/7. And we also have 10 other units in a building beside the older one with 10 units. And it's a challenge because we've had, in a previous practice, we would turn women away who were under the influence at all. Like if they smell a bit like pot, they couldn't come in. And also depending on which staff was at the door, because depending of how they were comfortable with that. And it's been an ethical issue as well, because we're sending, it's their safe space, and we're sending them away when they're coming back from drinking or something. So it was really a challenge, and we're also trying to reduce the barrier there. So before, like for a while, we had this practice of women had to check in after 8 p.m. to the 24/7 shelter before being able to enter their apartment in the non-staff shelter. That was creating issues because you have mom with 5 kids coming in at 8 o'clock with a bunch of kids and making her walk in the snow at the other shelter to check in and get the sniff test, if I can call it that way, which is kind of what it was, and then go back to be able to access. It was pretty terrible. So instead, we looked at what is harm reduction. Harm reduction would be, in this case, we will trust that women are coming and respecting your substance-free space. If there are issues with a resident, we will address it with that resident. Instead of applying a rule for everybody, that's creating barrier to accessing their space. And if a woman is coming under the influence after drinking, and maybe it happens that they get assaulted again, they get sexually assaulted, well, they have a safe space to go, and we're not sending them out in the cold again. So it is challenging because now we have clients saying, well, I was in the elevator the other day and this and so was smelling really strong of beer. And so it's working with the clients and explaining that we're trying to support women where they're at. And if there's issues with behavior, to for sure let us know. that there are cameras around the buildings. We watch women as they're coming in, as we're buzzing them in, because they have to be buzzed in. They can't open the door themselves to enter the building. So yeah, that's a good question, and that's kind of how we've been navigating that.
I also, sorry, Leah, I'm gonna jump in. I know we're running short on time. I do see a question about women who use substances and CAS involvement. And what I would like to note about that is Prairie Harm Reduction in Saskatoon, their family support unit has had a lot of success working with CAS. And usually what they do is they're talking even before the baby has been born, if that's an option, and working to create safety plans. Like maybe the plan is that if mom is going to use substances, then kids get dropped off with grandma while that's happening, or something like that. The plan's going to look individual for everyone, and maybe normally that plan would be looked at negatively by a worker, but because it's negotiated ahead of time and discussed ahead of time, then there are workarounds around that substance use to keep kids safe and also keep kids with mom, because it's obviously traumatic for both mom and their children to be separated.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for jumping in with that there. We, I think, made it through almost all of the questions, which is super impressive. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth and Ketsia, for that wonderful presentation. And thanks to everyone who listened in, who asked those really fantastic questions. I think this was a really helpful conversation.